At the end of World War I, the stab in the back theory claimed that the German army, though in retreat in the fall of 1918, could have kept up the fight had it not been betrayed by politicians who agreed to an armistice that November. The culprits were made out to be socialists, communists, and Jews who were said to have evaded battle and sought to overthrow the empire and benefit through worldwide trade and banking. This was, of course, a self-serving lie. The government and its loyalists needed a scapegoat. Germany's armies were being routed, its strategic situation was hopeless, its sailors were mutinying, its people were approaching starvation, and only the armistice, which the emperor's generals asked for, spared it from a much more painful defeat. Like other negative stereotypes about Jews, the stab-in-the-back legend was believed despite the fact that it was entirely untrue. German Jews had served in the German armed forces loyally, bravely, and out of proportion to their numbers in the population. We know this because of a census that was conducted to gain proof about the lack of Jewish presence on the front. But this census, conducted with anti-Semitic intent, came back with data showing that quite the opposite was true. The stab-in-the-back myth may have been a transparent falsehood, but it had a double advantage of bucking up a humiliated nation's pride and playing to its gut prejudices. Today, we can relate this very easily, and many have drawn to comparisons between this myth and Donald Trump's efforts to propagate the idea that Democrats in the United States manipulated election results in Biden's favor. In 1919, the Republic was declared. It was an exciting day. In Berlin and in other cities, people gathered as they heard about the abdication of Emperor William II. Imperial Chancellor Prince Max von Baden announced the abdication against William's will. He had never been asked. But a short time later, William agreed, thus ending the imperial age in Germany. He went into exile into the Netherlands. As a reaction to this development, it was said that the communists would proclaim a republic. But Social Democrat Reichstag delegate Philipp Scheidemann beat the Communist Party of Germany to the punch. At midday on November 9th, 1918, he proclaimed Germany as a republic from the balcony of the Reichstag in Berlin. Even though he had not been authorized to do so, and not all SPD officials were on his side, the people have triumphed, he said, to the throng of cheering people below. But from its first day on, the newly proclaimed republic had a heavy burden to bear. At 4 p.m., an equally large crowd had gathered at the Imperial Palace in Berlin. There, Karl Liebknecht also proclaimed a republic. His speech culminated in the proclamation of a free socialist Republic of Germany, which would bring an end to the Hohenzollern dynasty. Instead of the hated imperial standard, the red flag of the Free Republic of Germany should fly from now on. By the year's end, the unrest before the right-wing Freikorps paramilitary groups had reached such heights that the imperial chancellor had to act. Friedrich Ebert decreed that the Bloody Christmas, as it came to be known, should be suppressed with military means. On December 29, 1918, the transitional government collapsed and the situation escalated. Ebert appointed Gustav Noske to oversee the security of the government. As defense minister, he was responsible for the military. However, his tough approach to the unrest failed to bring peace. Rather, the opposite was the case. At the beginning of 1919, the fighting had spread even further. The Spartacist uprising, Spartacist, I think is how you say it. The Spartacist uprising resulted in conditions akin to a civil war. The uprising began after the discharge of the Berlin chief of police Emil Eichhorn. Eichhorn was a member of the communist KPD, which had merged with Liebknecht's Spartacus League at the end of 1918. Eichhorn's refusal to resign from his post sparked the uprising, causing riots in Berlin from January 8th to 10th, 1919. The Imperial Army was strengthened by the addition of the right-wing paramilitary Freikorps, which carried out a campaign against members of the Communist Party. After the defeat of the Spartacist uprising, the Freikorps went on a spree to cleanse the city of communists. As a result of this illegal mission, two of the KPD's icons, Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, were murdered on January 15th and thrown into Berlin's Landwehrkanal. From the get-go, therefore, the Republic was tainted by the blood of communist victims, and moderate, quote-unquote moderate, democratic forces siding with the extreme right. Now let's speak a little bit about hyperinflation in Germany. The Treaty of Versailles didn't just blame Germany for the war. It demanded financial restitution for the whole thing, to the tune of 132 billion gold marks, which are about $269 billion today. Billion. In November 1922, Germany defaulted on its reparation payment as scheduled. The first reparation payments had taken all she could afford to pay. The French believed Germany could make the repayment, but were choosing not to. However, the German government argued that they could not afford to pay. Added to this, abhorred conditions at home led to German workers calling for a strike. The government simply responded by printing more money. This flood of money led to hyperinflation, as the more money was printed, the more prices rose. Prices ran out of control. For example, a loaf of bread, which cost 250 marks in January 1923, had risen to 200,000 million marks in November 1923. By autumn 1923, it cost more to print a note than the note was worth. During this crisis, workers were often paid twice per day because prices rose so fast that their wages were virtually worthless by lunchtime. The bills money was printed on became worth more than the money itself. People used it for fire in the winter, and children played with stacks of money in the street. By the end of hyperinflation, any middle-class savings were understandably gone. Everyone worked from paycheck to paycheck. It took the intervention from the United States in the form of loans for Germany to be able to meet reparation commitments. The Dawes Plan, as it became known in history, ended the crisis in European diplomacy. The Ruhr area, which had been invaded by French forces in response to reparations not being paid, was to be evacuated by foreign troops. Reparation payments would begin at 1 billion marks the first year, increasing annually to 2.5 billion marks after 5 years. The German Reichsbank would be reorganized under Allied supervision, but most importantly, Germany was to be loaned about $200 million, primarily through Wall Street bond issues in the United States. Thanks to this plan, the new currency introduced became stable. Inflation had ended. The international economic ties, which some Germans felt was akin to enslavement and international servitude, were strengthened. It was a house of cards that would last through the next 6 years, until the Great Depression of 1929 would blow the whole thing down. Throughout its short-lived democracy, Germany experienced many attacks. The first notable attack was the Kapp Putsch in Berlin on March 13, 1920. Its goal was to undo the German Revolution of 1918 and 1919, to overthrow the Weimar Republic and establish an autocratic government in its place. It was supported by parts of the Reichswehr, as well as nationalist and monarchist fractions. Though the legitimate German government was forced to flee the city of Berlin, the coup failed after a few days when large sections of the German population followed a call by the German government to join a general strike. Most civil servants refused to cooperate with the Kapp and his allies. The German democracy was saved for now. From November 8th to November 9th, 1923, Adolf Hitler and his followers staged the Beer Hall Putsch in Munich, a failed takeover of the government in Bavaria, a state in southern Germany. Since 1921, Hitler had led the Nazi Party, a fledgling political group that promoted German pride and anti-Semitism and was unhappy with the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. Hitler was convicted of treason and sentenced to 5 years in prison. The presiding judge was Georg Neidhardt, a right-leaning judge with a stern look and a pointed white goatee. After the course of the trial, Neidhardt will be shockingly deferential to Hitler, allowing him to give long speeches, question witnesses, and often interrupt testimony with interjections. Hitler's popularity increased during this trial, and his defense speeches were printed in the newspapers. He spent less than a year behind bars, during which time he dictated his political autobiography, Mein Kampf, to his deputy Rudolf Hess. In it, he laid out his plan. He proclaimed that he would use democracy against itself, get elected, and use its weaknesses to destroy the hated system. A putsch didn't work, but this would. If you read Mein Kampf, you would know what Hitler had in mind, but very few people at the time did actually read Mein Kampf, and who could blame them? Landsberg was a relatively comfortable prison, intended for inmates who were considered misguided rather than dangerous. Hitler was allowed to receive visitors as well as fan mail from admirers. The putsch and Hitler's subsequent trial turned him into a national figure. After prison, he worked to rebuild the Nazi Party and gain power via legal political methods. During Hitler's imprisonment, the Nazi Party and their propaganda newspaper, the Angriff, which means the attack, and another newspaper of theirs called Völkische Beobachter, which would be the racial or the people's observer. Völkisch has both meanings, racial and of the people, were at times banned and at times allowed. The enemy of the Republic throughout the Weimar Republic was often perceived on the left rather than on the right. Much greater was the police persecution of communists than that of the Nazis. After Walter Rathenau, a beloved politician, was murdered by right-wing extremists on June 24, 1922, Chancellor Josef Wirth gave a speech in front of the Reichstag the next day in which he warned that we are experiencing in Germany a political brutalization that was characterized by an atmosphere of murder, of rancor, of poison, and famously proclaimed, "The enemy is on the right." But this was not the impression of an average German. Communists were seen as a threat, trying to equalize everyone, making everyone equally poor with Soviet Russia as their model. With historical distance, we can for sure say that the communists were never had the means to pull that off. When the 1929 Great Depression hit Germany and unemployment surged, Nazis saw their hour had come. The US Wall Street crash sent waves through the indebted German populations. Nazis in their uniforms beat up peaceful communist protesters in the streets. They modeled themselves as the protectors of wealth and the middle class. They stood for law and order, and they would do anything to defend it. The police had a similar agenda, as a fateful day showed. Blutmai, Blood May, refers to the 1929 killing of 33 Communist Party of Germany supporters and uninvolved civilians by the Berlin police over a 3-day period, after a KPD International Workers' Day celebration was attacked by police. The Nazi Party's meteoric rise to power began shortly afterwards in 1930, when it attained 107 seats in Germany's parliament, the Reichstag. In July 1932, the Nazi Party became the largest political party in the Reichstag, with 230 representatives. In the final years of the Weimar Republic, from 1930 to 1933, the government ruled by emergency decree because it could not attain a parliamentary majority. Political and economic instability, coupled with voter dissatisfaction with the status quo, benefited the Nazi Party. As a result of the Nazis' mass support, German President Paul von Hindenburg appointed Hitler Chancellor on January 30th, 1933. Famously, the moderate parties thought they could make Hitler their puppet. The opposite transpired. His appointment paved the way to the Nazi dictatorship after Hindenburg's death. Shortly after Hitler's appointment as Chancellor, the Reichstag fire happened. Not many people in 1933, and no one since 1945, believed the Nazis' claim that the communists set the fire. One man, a 24-year-old journeyman mason from Holland, named Marinus van der Lubbe, was arrested inside the building. Van der Lubbe claimed from the moment of his arrest until his execution by guillotine in January 1934 that he had set the fire alone. But he was 80% blind, and at his trial in the fall of 1933 appeared to be mentally handicapped, and so few people saw him as a plausible culprit. Most people who were free to think for themselves in 1933, for instance, all of the foreign correspondents at van der Lubbe's trial, believed in a third possibility. The fire in the Reichstag had been a Nazi conspiracy, with van der Lubbe playing the role of a dupe direct suspicion toward the communists. Most historians to this day hold to the position that van der Lubbe was the sole culprit, even though scientific evidence about the course of the fire has shown again and again that one person could not have set the devastating fire in the Reichstag's plenary chamber, and plausible circumstantial evidence points to a small group of Berlin SA men, so Nazis, as the real culprits. Whoever did light the Reichstag fire, the Nazis were the clear benefactors of the action. Even as the Reichstag burned, the arrests began. The new government of national concentration under Adolf Hitler, in office for only 4 weeks and facing an election in 6 more days, claimed immediately that the fire was a signal for a communist uprising and used this pretext to lock away thousands of opponents. On the morning of February 28th, Hitler's government was ready with the legal text that has become known as the Reichstag Fire Decree, an enactment that stripped the Weimar Constitution of all individual rights, speech, assembly, freedom from arbitrary arrests, etc. Communists and left-leaning party members went underground. Many were arrested and tortured. Ironically, this law was called in its original German language the Law for the Protection of the German People. Who was to remain German under this law was the question at hand. It is in this context that Hitler called for a vote on a new measure which would dissolve Parliament and give him the right to issue laws without the consent of Germany's Parliament, laying the foundation for the complete Nazification of German society. The law was passed on March 23, 1933, and published the following day. Its full name was the Law to Remedy the Distress of the People and the Reich. Adolf Hitler and the Nazi Party used intimidation and persecution to ensure the passage of the law. They prevented all 81 communists and 26 of the 120 social democrats from taking their seats, detaining them in Nazi-controlled camps. German judges did not challenge the law. They viewed Hitler's government as legitimate and continued to regard themselves as state servants who owed him their allegiance and support. Otto Wels was the only German parliamentary leader to openly oppose passage of the Enabling Act. He accused the Nazis of wanting to eliminate the Reichstag in order to continue their national revolution. He concluded his speech by expressing the SPD's support of a state guided by the rule of law, equal rights, and social justice. In this historical hour, we German Social Democrats pledge ourselves to the principles of humanity and justice, of freedom and socialism. No enabling act gives you the power to eradicate ideas which are eternal and indestructible. Wels escaped from Germany to Prague and then to Paris, where he died in September 1939 at the age of 66. He had himself witnessed and called the death of democracy 3 years prior, that fateful day of the adoption of the Enabling Act. It is impossible to know exactly how much anti-Semitism and anti-communist sentiment, the economic crisis, and the indecision of democratic politicians individually weighed in the ultimate rise of power of the Nazi Party, but they all had a key role to play in its downfall. The lies of the stab-in-the-back myth and many others would become doctrine under Nazi rule. While this history is not necessarily taught in classes about the Second World War, knowing this is crucial to preventing totalitarian forces to gain power today and seek their natural conclusion in hatred and violence. The seeds of the Holocaust were planted long before the outbreak of World War II.